The night my daughter told me to shut up in front of everyone. Something inside me went completely still. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I quietly stood up, took back what I still controlled, and walked out without a scene. She thought the moment was over, but what happened next would change her life in ways she never saw coming. Before I tell you how that night changed everything, do me one small favor. Stay with this story, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Stories like this travel far when they're shared quietly. I never imagined my life would come to this. I was a man who built this family with his hands, his back, and his silence. From the moment my daughter, Elena, was born, my life stopped belonging to me. I grew up poor in a narrow industrial town called Ravenport, where hunger was normal and warmth was something you earned. I promised myself that my child would never know that life. Not once. Not even for a moment. I worked wherever there was work. Construction sites by day, broken machinery in oil-stained garages by night. Weekends hauling bricks beside men young enough to be my sons. I never complained. Pain was a price, and I paid it gladly. Every blister, every ache, every night my body trembled from exhaustion was worth it, because when I came home, Elena was there. I still remember her first steps across our tiny living room. She stumbled, fell forward, and landed straight into my arms. In that moment, with an empty wallet and tired bones, I felt richer than any man I knew. I told myself then, as long as I breathe, she will never go without. And she didn't. School fees were paid on time. Uniforms were bought before the year began. Books, trips, lunches. She never missed anything. If that meant I drank tea for dinner while she slept full and warm, so be it. Fathers are meant to disappear quietly so their children can shine. When she wanted college, I sold my old car, the one I dreamed of fixing up for my retirement. I took loans in my own name. I worked overtime until my hands shook. When she walked across that stage in her graduation gown, I cried openly, not because I was tired or broke, but because I had kept my promise. Then came her wedding. I watched her walk down the aisle glowing, and for a moment, it felt like her mother, my late wife, was beside me again, smiling at the family we had built. I paid for the reception. Every flower, every plate, every chair. People told me it wasn't my responsibility. They didn't understand. Her happiness had always been my responsibility. Even after she married Marcus, I kept giving. When they wanted a house in Clearfield Heights, I helped with a loan. I co-signed papers. I paid the deposit. I made sure they didn't start their marriage drowning in debt. That house carried my fingerprints in every corner. I believed foolishly that it would always have a place for me. Family dinners became sacred to me. They weren't just meals. They were proof that I still belonged. When my wife was alive, Sundays meant food, stories, and laughter until candles burned low. After she passed, those dinners were all I had left of that warmth. Every time Elena invited me over, I wore my best shirt. I polished my shoes. I brought small gifts for the grandchildren, books, puzzles, sometimes candy she said they didn't need. I wanted them to remember their grandfather with warmth, not distance. I told them stories about their grandmother's laughter, about building houses with bare hands, about where we came from. I wanted them to know I wasn't just an old man in a chair. I was part of the foundation of their lives. And for a while, I believe Elena understood that. But the change didn't come all at once. It came in size, in eye rolls, in short answers. When I repeated a story, she'd say, "Dad, we've heard this already." I smiled and nodded. When I spoke about her mother, she'd cut me off. I told myself she was tired, stressed, busy. The grandchildren began copying her. They'd glance at their mother before listening to me. Sometimes they giggled when she did. Children learn quickly who matters. Once, after dinner, I started telling them about how their grandmother used to sew clothes by hand. Elena stood up, clapped her hands, and said, "All right, kids, bedtime. Grandpa's boring stories can wait." She laughed. The children followed her upstairs. I sat alone with unfinished words in my throat. Another time, I brought an old photo album. She pushed it aside and said, "We don't need old pictures cluttering the house." Clutter. Those pictures were my life. Marcus began joining in. A smirk here, a chuckle there. Once, when I forgot a name, he muttered, losing it, "Huh?" They laughed. I pretended not to hear. I endured it all, because I remembered holding Elena's hand through fevers, skipping meals so she could eat, walking miles so she could afford the bus. How could I give up on that love? I told myself it was a phase. I was wrong. The distance hardened. She only called when she needed something. She never asked how I was. And slowly I realized something terrifying. I wasn't her father anymore. I was an inconvenience. And then came the dinner. The table was set. The children were seated. I wore my best shirt. To me, these dinners were holy. The heartbeat of the last family I had. There was a pause in conversation, and I thought it was the right moment. I cleared my throat gently and said, "You know, when your grandmother was your age..." Elena snapped, "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." The room froze. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. Then Marcus laughed. That laugh shattered something in me. The children stared at their plates. Embarrassed. Silent. Learning. I said nothing. I lowered my fork. Finished my meal quietly. Folded my napkin. And in that silence, I understood something that would change everything. That was the last dinner I would ever sit through in that house. I didn't drive home right away after that dinner. I sat in my car at the edge of their driveway, the engine off, the night pressing around me. The glow from the kitchen window spilled onto the pavement, and through the glass I could see Elena moving about, stacking dishes, laughing softly with Marcus. From the outside, they looked like a complete family. Warm, whole, and I was parked just beyond it, an afterthought. Her words replayed again and again. "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." I gripped the steering wheel until my hands hurt. Not from anger. Anger would have been easier, but from the slow, crushing realization that the respect I thought I'd earned over a lifetime had evaporated without me noticing. For years, I had explained away every slight, every sigh, every dismissal. I told myself love meant endurance, that sacrifice meant silence. But sitting there in the dark, I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding. Love does not require humiliation. Respect is not optional. And silence, when forced on you, is not peace. I thought of my wife, Mary Ann. If she had been alive, she would never have allowed our daughter to speak to me that way. She would have stood between us without hesitation. Losing her had left a space I never filled, and Elena had grown into that space without realizing what she was taking. After nearly an hour, I started the engine and drove away. The road blurred through tears I didn't bother to hide. But beneath the pain was something new. Resolve. Quiet. Steady. Unshakable. That night, when I reached my small home on the outskirts of Northvale, I didn't go straight to bed. I sat at the kitchen table instead, under the dim light, and stared at the surface where my hands had rested for years while paying bills, signing forms, planning a future I assumed would always include my daughter. I whispered one word into the empty room. Enough. When I woke the next morning, her voice was still there in my head, sharp and cruel. But this time it didn't only sting. It clarified. Elena believed age had made me harmless, that years of quiet sacrifice had drained me of authority, that I was just an old man clinging to memories and invitations. She had forgotten something important. I had never signed everything away. After breakfast, I opened the old filing cabinet in the corner of my living room, the one I rarely touched anymore. Inside were folders thick with paper, deeds, titles, account statements, contracts. Proof of a life built slowly, deliberately, with my name written everywhere. The house in Clearfield Heights? My signature was still there. The car Elena drove? Registered and insured under my name. The family fund she dipped into whenever things got tight? Mine. Even a retirement account she assumed would someday pass quietly to her? Still under my control. I sat there for a long time, reading documents I hadn't needed to think about in years. Each page reminded me of something I had allowed to happen. Not because I was weak, but because I believed love meant never pulling back. I understood now how wrong that belief had been. Silence is only weakness when you have nothing else. I had plenty. I didn't confront her. I didn't call. I didn't ask for an apology. That would have changed nothing. Words had already lost their value at her table. My answer would not be spoken. It would be executed. That afternoon, I took my keys from the hook by the door, the spare set I'd always carried. I turned them over my palm. The car keys were heavier than I remembered. They weren't just metal. They were leverage. That evening, Elena called. "Dad," she said, irritation already in her voice. "You forgot your jacket here." I thanked her politely and told her I'd pick it up another day. She didn't apologize. She didn't mention the dinner. To her, the insult was over, forgotten, filed away. That told me everything I needed to know. The next day, I began preparing. Quietly, I called my lawyer, Thomas Hale, a man who had handled my affairs for years. When I told him I needed to make immediate changes, he didn't question my reasons. He simply asked, "Are you certain?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I am." We scheduled a meeting for the following week. Until then, I reviewed my accounts. I listed assets. I noted which responsibilities I had taken on that were never truly mine to carry. With each line I wrote, I felt something lift from my chest. The fog I'd lived under for years began to clear. I wasn't taking something away out of spite. I was reclaiming what I had never truly given. I also began to see how carefully Elena had arranged her life around my silence. How comfortable she had become assuming I would always absorb discomfort, so she didn't have to feel it. That comfort was about to end. A few days later, I returned to their house to collect my jacket. The children were at school. Marcus was at work. Elena stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You've been distant," she said. I smiled gently. "I've been thinking." She scoffed. "About what?" "About what's best for me." She rolled her eyes. "Dad, don't start." I didn't. I took my jacket and left. That was the last time I would step into that house as her father. From that day forward, I began putting space between us. Not dramatically, not visibly. I simply stopped being available. When she called, I returned messages late, or not at all. When she hinted about bills or repairs, I told her I'd look into it and didn't. She noticed, of course, but she didn't worry yet. She had never known me to withdraw completely. She assumed I would come back. At night, alone in my quiet house, I replayed memories, not with longing but with honesty. I saw how often I had swallowed my pride to keep peace. How many times I had mistaken endurance for love. I didn't hate my daughter, but I no longer trusted her with my dignity. The meeting with Thomas arrived sooner than I expected. As I sat in his office, sunlight filtering through the blinds, I felt calm, not nervous, not uncertain. We reviewed everything. The will, the properties, the accounts. When he asked if I wanted to make changes, I nodded. "Remove her," I said quietly. He paused only a second, then continued. That afternoon, paperwork began moving. Signatures replaced assumptions. Control returned to where it belonged. And while Elena went about her life believing she had silenced an old man at her table, she had no idea that my silence had already begun speaking for me. The changes didn't announce themselves. They never do. They move quietly at first, slipping into place while the other person continues living as if nothing has shifted. That was the part Elena didn't understand. She thought distance was a mood, a phase, something that would pass once I cooled down. I wasn't cooling down. I was withdrawing. The week after my meeting with Thomas, I moved through my days with deliberate calm. I still woke early, still made my tea the same way, still walked the same route around Northvale in the mornings. On the surface, nothing had changed, but underneath that routine, every step was measured, every decision final. Elena called twice that week. The first time, I let it ring. The second time, I answered. "Dad," she said, sounding annoyed more than concerned. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I replied. There was a pause. She wasn't used to that answer. Usually, fine was followed by an explanation, reassurance, an offer help. This time, there was nothing. You've been distant, she said again. I've been busy. With what? My life. She sighed. You're being dramatic. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. Anytime I asserted myself, she called it drama. It was how she dismissed things she didn't want to examine. I'll talk to you later, I said, and ended the call before she could respond. My hands didn't shake when I put the phone down. My chest didn't tighten. Instead, I felt a strange lightness, as if I had set down something heavy I'd been carrying, without realizing it. The next step was practical. I called the insurance company about the car Elena drove. The conversation was short, polite, efficient, a change in authorization, a confirmation number. Done. I contacted the bank about the family fund, the one I'd created years earlier to help her through emergencies. I hadn't touched it in a long time. Neither had she, at least not openly. The transfers had become routine, automatic, invisible. I made them stop. There was no anger in those calls. No raised voices. Just facts. I noticed something then. Each time I reclaimed control over one small piece of my life, my breathing grew easier. The tightness I'd lived with for years began to loosen muscle by muscle. That was when I realized how deeply I'd been holding my breath. A few days later, Elena showed up at my house without calling first. I heard the knock and knew it was her before I opened the door. She always knocked too loudly, too impatiently, as if doors existed to be challenged rather than respected. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed, irritation written across her face. You didn't tell me you were changing things, she said immediately. Changing what? I asked. The bank called, she snapped. There was a delay with the transfer. I looked at her calmly. There was no delay. The transfer ended. Her eyes widened, just slightly. What do you mean, ended? I mean I closed the arrangement. You can't just do that, she said. We rely on that. The word rely landed heavily between us. I relied on respect, I said quietly. We're both adjusting. She scoffed. This is because of that stupid dinner, isn't it? I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch. I wanted her to feel it, the way I had felt silence at her table. Finally, I said, You told me nobody cared. She waved her hand dismissively. I was frustrated. You talk too much sometimes. Something in me hardened then, not with anger, but with clarity. You don't get to decide when my voice matters, I said. And you don't get to enjoy the benefits of my silence anymore. Her face flushed. So you're punishing me now? No, I said. I'm choosing myself. She stared at me as if I were speaking a language she didn't understand. Marcus stepped out of the car, behind her then. He'd been waiting, listening. He always did. This is ridiculous, he said. You're tearing the family apart over a comment. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing. Not anger, not resentment, just distance. The family didn't fall apart today, I said. It's been coming apart for years. Elena laughed sharply. You're being dramatic again. I nodded once. That's your word for boundaries. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. I'm not discussing this, I said. I'm informing you. Her expression changed then. The irritation gave way to something else. Unease. What are you doing, Dad? She asked more quietly. I'm stepping back, I replied, from everything that makes me small. She looked around my modest living room, as if expecting to see some grand plan laid out on the table. Instead, she saw only me, calm, still, unmoving. You'll regret this, she said. I smiled gently. I regret staying silent for so long. That was the moment she realized something was different, that this wasn't a mood, that I wasn't waiting for her to soften or apologize, that I wasn't going to chase her approval anymore. She left without another word. The call started after that, not just from Elena, but from relatives, friends, people who had always known me as the quiet one, the accommodating one. They spoke carefully, choosing their words as if walking on thin ice. She's upset, one said, She didn't mean it, another insisted. Family is family, someone else reminded me. I listened. I thanked them. And then I did nothing. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. That silence confused them. It made them uncomfortable. But discomfort, I was learning, was not my responsibility. A week later, Thomas called to tell me the paperwork was nearly complete. The changes to the will are finalized, he said. The property is ready to be listed whenever you say the word. I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to mark the moment. List it, I said. That evening, Elena called again. This time, her voice was sharp with panic. What do you mean the house is being sold? She demanded. It means what it says. I replied. You can't do this, she said. That's our home. It's my property, I corrected gently. I let you live there. I didn't give it to you. There was silence on the line, thick and stunned. You're serious, she said finally. Yes. Her voice rose. You're destroying everything over one sentence. I didn't argue. I'm ending something that stopped being healthy. I said, you decided I was invisible. I decided not to be. She hung up on me. I sat there for a long time after the call ended, staring at the wall. I expected to feel guilt, or doubt, or grief. Instead, I felt steady. The days that followed were quieter than any I could remember. No invitations. No updates. No casual calls asking for help. Elena was busy scrambling, trying to regain footing on ground that had shifted beneath her without warning. And me? I was finally standing still. I understood then that what I was doing wasn't cruelty. It was correction, not her behavior. Because that was no longer my concern, but of my own. I had spent a lifetime confusing sacrifice with love. Now, I was learning the difference. And that difference was about to become impossible for her to ignore. Once the house was listed, everything changed, not loudly, not all at once, but in the way pressure builds behind a wall you didn't know was load-bearing. Elena discovered very quickly how much of her life rested on assumptions she'd never bothered to question. The kind of assumptions that feel permanent right up until the moment they aren't. The first sign was confusion. She called again 2 days after hanging up on me, her voice carefully neutral, like she was testing the ground. Dad, she said, the agent contacted us. There must be some misunderstanding. There isn't, I replied. You can't expect us to just leave, she continued, ignoring my answer. We have kids. We have routines. I know, I said. That response unsettled her more than anger ever would have. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't offending myself. I was acknowledging reality without offering rescue. Marcus took the phone from her then. I could hear in the shift of breathing, the change in cadence. You're acting irrational, he said. This isn't how families handle conflict. I smiled faintly. Families also don't laugh when elders are humiliated. He scoffed. You're twisting things. No, I said. I'm remembering them clearly. He launched into a speech about stability, about the children, about how disruptive this would be. He spoke as if logistics could erase disrespect, as if inconvenience outweighed dignity. I let him finish. I'm not asking you to understand, I said. I'm informing you. There was silence on the line, not the silence of shock, something colder. The silence of realizing the leverage had vanished. After that, the calls became frequent and frantic. Elena's tone shifted day by day. Irritation gave way to disbelief. Disbelief to panic. Panic to something dangerously close to pleading. Each voicemail traced the arc of her realization that the safety net she'd taken for granted was being pulled away strand by strand. Dad, please call me back. This is getting serious. We need to talk like adults. You're overreacting. You're hurting the kids. I didn't mean it like that. I listened to none of them in full. I wasn't ignoring her out of spite. I was doing something much harder. I was refusing to be pulled back into the pattern. Every time I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to explain, to reassure, to soften, I reminded myself of the dinner table, the fork frozen midair, the laughter, The word nobody delivered like a verdict. I had explained myself for years. It had only taught her that explanations were optional. The house began showing the following week. I didn't attend the first viewing. I didn't want to. The house had been mine long before it became theirs. But watching strangers walk through felt like reopening something I'd already closed. Instead, I took a long walk through Northvale. Then the late afternoon sun settled into my bones. That walk was when the second shift happened. Outside of Elena's life and inside mine, people noticed. Neighbors would always wave politely, now stop to talk. Not to pry, not directly, but with the kind of careful curiosity people use when they sense something has changed. I heard the place in Clearfield Heights is on the market, one said. Yes, I replied. That's a big move, another remarked. It's time, I said. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. The more simply I spoke, the more certain I felt. Certainty has a gravity to it. People sense it. They stop pushing when they realize there's nothing to push against. Elena, however, did not stop. She came to my house again, this time alone. I saw her car pull up and felt a brief tightening in my chest. Not fear, not guilt, just recognition. This was another attempt. Another angle. I opened the door before she knocked. Her face was pale. Her eyes tired. She looked older than I remembered. And for a moment, a flicker of the past stirred in me. The urge to protect, to soothe, to step back into the role she'd assigned me. I let it pass. Can we talk? She asked quietly. We are talking. I replied, standing in the doorway. She swallowed. Dad, I said something I shouldn't have said. Yes, I agreed. I was stressed, she continued quickly. The kids were loud. You were talking. Everything just... You told me nobody cares, I said, gently but firmly. That wasn't about stress. She looked down. I didn't mean it like that. Meaning follows behavior. I said, not intention. Her eyes snapped up. So that's it? One mistake and you destroy everything? I shook my head. This wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern. And I didn't destroy anything. I stopped maintaining it. She laughed bitterly. You're acting like a victim. No, I said. I'm acting like someone who finally stopped pretending. There was the moment she realized this wasn't about the house or the money. It was about authority, about control, about the fact that for the first time in her adult life, I wasn't bending to her version of events. You're being cruel, she said. I'm being clear, I answered. She stood there for a long time, searching my face for something, weakness, maybe hesitation, a crack she could press. She found none. When she left, she didn't slam the door. She didn't shout. She simply walked back to her car, shoulders rigid, and drove away. That silence afterward felt different than before. It felt earned. The sale progressed quickly after that. The market was favorable. Offers came in. I chose one without emotion, reviewed the paperwork, and signed. With each signature, another thread tying my life to hers loosened and fell away. The money from the sale didn't excite me. It grounded me. It reminded me that independence wasn't theoretical. It was practical, tangible, real. When Elena received notice of the sale's progress, the calls intensified briefly, then stopped altogether. That was the third shift. The silence returned. But this time, it wasn't just mine. She had run out of moves. Mutual relatives tried again. Softer this time. Less insistent. They spoke of forgiveness. Of understanding. Of keeping peace for the children's sake. I listened. I nodded. And then I said something I'd never said before. I am at peace. They didn't know how to respond to that. Peace doesn't leave room for negotiation. The children crossed my mind often during those weeks. Not with guilt, but with sadness. They hadn't hurt me. They'd been taught. One day, they would understand. Or they wouldn't. That was no longer something I could control. I made a conscious decision then, not to disappear from their lives in anger, but to step away with dignity. If they reached out someday with genuine curiosity and respect, I would decide then. Until that day, distance was the healthiest choice for all of us. As autumn approached, I began preparing for a move of my own. Not a retreat, A beginning. I found a small place outside Northvale, quieter, closer to nature. It didn't impress anyone. It didn't need to. It felt right. Packing was simple. I didn't own much beyond what mattered. Clothes, books, photographs. The small, essential pieces of a life that had been reduced to its truth. The night before I moved, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by boxes. I expected to feel sorrow or nostalgia. Instead, I felt something steadier. Pride. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that comes from choosing yourself after a lifetime of putting everyone else first. I understood then that the most powerful action I had taken wasn't selling a house or changing a will. It was refusing to sit at a table where my dignity had no place. And once that refusal was made, everything else followed naturally. The silence that followed the sale of the house was unlike anything I had known before. It wasn't tense or heavy the way silence had felt at Elena's dinner table. This silence was spacious. It had room to breathe. It allowed thoughts to rise and fall without being interrupted by guilt, expectation, or the need to explain myself. I moved into the new place at the edge of Stonebrook, a quiet stretch of land where mornings arrived slowly and evenings settled without ceremony. The house was modest. One floor, a small porch, tall trees lining the back like old guards who had seen enough of the world to keep their distance. I liked that about them. On my first night there, I slept without dreaming. That alone told me how much weight I had been carrying. The days that followed were gentle in their routine. I unpacked slowly, placing things where they felt right instead of where they were expected to go. I hung my wife's photograph in the living room, not as a shrine, but as a quiet presence. I arranged my books by memory rather than category. I brewed my coffee the way I always had, except now I drank it without listening for a phone call that might pull me back into someone else's urgency. Elena didn't call. Neither did Marcus. At first, I thought there'd be a delayed explosion, angry messages, accusations, maybe even legal threats. I was prepared for that. Thomas had prepared me well. Everything I had done was clean, documented, and within my rights. But the explosion never came. Instead, there was absence. That absence forced me to confront something unexpected. Without conflict to react to, I had to decide who I was without resistance shaping me. For years, I had defined myself in response to others, what they needed, what they expected, what they dismissed. Now, there was no one pushing. No one pulling. Just me. I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the present. Not in a nostalgic way, but in a practical one. What did I enjoy? What did I want my days to feel like? These questions felt unfamiliar at first, almost indulgent, but I answered them anyway. I took long walks through the woods behind the house. I sat by the small river nearby and listened to the water move without urgency. I cooked simple meals and ate them slowly, without distraction. No one rushed me. No one rolled their eyes if I spoke aloud to myself. I spoke aloud more often than I expected. Not because I was lonely, but because I was no longer silencing myself. Occasionally, a thought of Elena would surface, uninvited, sharp around the edges. I would picture her at that dinner table, confident in her authority, certain of her position. Then I would picture the empty house, the sold sign replaced by someone else's name. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt alignment. Weeks passed. Word filtered back to me through quiet channels. Not gossip, exactly, just fragments. Elena and Marcus had moved into a smaller place temporarily. The children were unsettled. Routines were disrupted. There was tension. I didn't respond to any of it. Not because I lacked compassion, but because compassion no longer required self-erasure. I could wish them well, without stepping back into the role that had nearly hollowed me out. One afternoon, Thomas called. "Everything's settled," he said. "No loose ends." "Good," I replied. There was a pause. "How are you holding up?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm steady," I said, for the first time in a long while. He seemed to understand what that meant. After that call, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low and thought about the word legacy. For most of my life, I had believed legacy was about what you leave behind. Houses, savings, opportunities, things you pass down. I was beginning to understand that legacy is also about what you refuse to pass on. I had refused to pass on silence born of fear. I had refused to pass on the idea that respect is optional within families. I had refused to teach my grandchildren, by example, that love requires humiliation, that refusal mattered more than any asset. One evening, as autumn deepened, my phone rang. Elena's name lit the screen. I didn't answer. Not because I was afraid of what she might say, but because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. The old pattern would attempt to reassert itself. Explanation, justification, emotional bargaining. I let the phone ring until it stopped. A voicemail followed. Her voice sounded different, tired, stripped of its sharp edges. "Dad," she said quietly, "we need to talk. Please." I listened once. Then I deleted it. I didn't feel cruel. I felt complete. There's a moment when you step out of a long-standing dynamic where the other person reaches for you not out of understanding, but out of discomfort. They want the old structure back because it was familiar, even if it was harmful. I wasn't willing to rebuild what I had just dismantled. The nights grew longer, the air cooler. I lit fires in the small hearth and watched the flames settle into embers. There is something honest about fire. It doesn't pretend. It burns or it doesn't. I thought about all the times I had burned quietly so others could stay warm. Not anymore. As winter approached, I made a decision about the remainder of my assets. Not impulsively. Thoughtfully, I met with Thomas again and redirected portions of what I owned. Not to Elena, not to relatives who had suddenly grown concerned, but to causes that reflected my values. Education programs, trade schools, support for families who understood effort and gratitude. It wasn't about punishment. It was about intention. I wanted what I had built to support growth, not entitlement. When the paperwork was finalized, I felt no need to announce it. No satisfaction in the secrecy. It simply felt right. The final call from Elena came shortly before the first snow. Her voice was strained, controlled, but barely. "You're really not going to talk to me?" she asked. I considered answering then. Truly, not to reconcile, but to close the loop. But closure is often just another name for reopening. I let the call go unanswered. After that, the phone stayed quiet. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. I noticed something profound in that stretch of time. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped wondering how my words would be received. I stopped carrying the phantom weight of someone else's expectations. I slept better, ate better, laughed more easily, even when alone. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. I had been lonely for years at crowded tables. Now, in my own company, I felt accompanied. One morning, while shoveling snow from the porch, I paused and leaned on the shovel handle, breathing in the cold air. My body ached in the familiar ways of age, but the ache felt honest, earned, not compounded by resentment or grief. I realized then that I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies, not for understanding, not for permission. I had already given myself what I needed. That realization settled into me quietly, like the final piece of a structure clicking into place. I hadn't torn anything down in anger. I had simply stopped holding something up that no longer deserved my strength. And in doing so, I had discovered how much strength I still had. Winter settled fully into Stonebrick, quiet and unannounced, the way real change always does. Snow covered the ground in slow layers, muting the world until even sound seemed respectful. I found comfort in that. The silence outside matched the silence I had chosen inside my life. By then, it had been months since I last heard Elena's voice. Long enough that the sharpness of memory had dulled, leaving only clarity behind. I didn't replay the dinner table scene anymore. Not because I had forgiven it, but because it no longer needed my attention. It had served its purpose. It had shown me the truth. Still, life has a way of testing decisions right when you think they're settled. The test came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was shoveling the last of the snow from the front steps when I noticed a car at the edge of the driveway. It wasn't one I recognized. The engine stayed running. For a moment, I assumed it was someone lost. Then the driver's door opened. Marcus stepped out. He looked thinner, tighter around the eyes. The confidence he used to wear so easily had faded into something brittle. He stood there awkwardly, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, unsure whether to approach. I didn't wave. I didn't invite him closer. Eventually, he walked up the drive, stopping several feet away, as if an invisible line had been drawn between us. "Morning," he said. I nodded. "Marcus." He glanced around, taking in the house, the trees, the quiet. "Didn't know you moved out this far." I didn't announce it. He shifted his weight. "Elena didn't know where you were either." I went back to shoveling. "She's worried," he continued. I didn't respond. "She's had a rough few months." I paused then, resting my hands on the shovel handle. Slowly I looked at him. "Why are you here?" I asked. He exhaled sharply. "Because this has gone too far." That word again. Too far. As if the boundary I'd drawn had somehow crossed into his territory. "You humiliated me in your house," I said calmly. This is the distance that followed. He frowned. "That was one moment." "It was the only moment that mattered," I replied. He ran a hand through his hair. "You're punishing her." "No," I said. "I'm no longer protecting her from consequences." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "She didn't mean it the way it came out." "She meant it enough to say it," I replied. "And you meant it enough to laugh." That landed. His jaw tightened. "You're holding on to the past." "I let go of it," I said. "That's why we're standing here instead of at your table." He looked away toward the trees, then back at me. "The kids miss you." I studied his face carefully, searching for sincerity. "Do they?" I asked. "Or do you miss what I provided?" He didn't answer. "That's what I thought," I said. Silence stretched between us, thick but controlled. Snow drifted from a tree branch and fell softly to the ground, punctuating the moment. "Elena wants to talk," he said finally. "I'm aware. She's ready to apologize." I shook my head slowly. "No, she's ready to restore access." "That's not fair," he snapped. I met his eyes. "Neither was telling a man who built your family to shut up and then laughing about it." He flinched. "This isn't about punishment," I continued. "It's about finality. Some doors close quietly. You don't break them down because you don't like the silence on the other side." He took a step forward. I didn't move. "You really won't reconsider?" he asked. I looked past him, toward the line of trees marking the edge of my land. "I already did. Months ago." He stood there for a long moment, then sighed. "She thought you'd cool off." I smiled faintly. "I did. Cooling off is what allowed me to see clearly." His shoulders sagged slightly, as if something inside him had finally accepted what his mind still resisted. "She's struggling," he said quietly. "I struggled too," I replied. "For years. Alone." That was the end of the conversation. He nodded once, turned, and walked back to his car. The tires crunched softly against the snow as he pulled away. I went back to shoveling. My hands were steady. That encounter confirmed something important. Elena hadn't changed. She had adjusted tactics. When anger failed, she sent Marcus. When demands failed, she offered apologies. Not because she understood, but because she was uncomfortable. Understanding comes with humility. Discomfort comes with urgency. I knew the difference now. The next call came a week later, from a number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Dad." Elena's voice said cautiously. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in pain, but in recognition. This was the final test. "Yes," I said. She exhaled audibly, as if relieved I'd answered it all. "Thank you for picking up." "What do you want?" I asked gently. There was a pause. I need to understand how we got here." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "You don't need to understand. You need to accept." "That's not fair," she said quickly. "You just disappeared." "No," I replied. "I stopped showing up where I wasn't respected." Her voice wavered. I said something in frustration. "You revealed something in comfort." I said. Silence. "I'm sorry," she said at last. The words were soft, carefully placed, practiced. I believe you're sorry now, I replied. That doesn't undo what came before. So that's it, she asked. You cut me out of your life over one sentence. I stopped sacrificing myself over a lifetime of them. She began to cry then, quietly at first, then openly. I never meant to hurt you, she said. I know, I replied. But you did. Can we fix this? She asked. I thought about the question carefully. I owed her that much. No, I said finally. We can't fix what required me to disappear, survive. She sobbed softly on the other end of the line. I waited. I didn't rush her. I didn't comfort her either. I miss you, she said. I miss who you used to be. I replied. Another pause. What do I tell the kids? She asked. I chose my words carefully. Tell them their grandfather loves them enough to teach them that dignity matters. She didn't respond. I won't disappear from their memories, I continued, but I won't re-enter a place where my voice is a nuisance. The call ended shortly after that. Not angrily, not dramatically. It simply ended. I set the phone down and sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. That conversation marked the true end, not because I hung up, not because she cried, but because I didn't feel pulled back afterward. No ache, no doubt, no urge to fix anything. The boundary had held. Spring came slowly to Stonebrook. Snow melted. The river swelled. Birds returned. With them came a sense of renewal that felt earned rather than borrowed. I spent more time outside, fixed things around the house, built a small bench near the trees where I liked to sit in the afternoons. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I realized something quietly profound. I was no longer angry. Anger had been a stage, not a destination. It had burned away illusions, not replaced them. What remained was steadiness. People often mistake walking away for weakness. They imagine strength only exists in confrontation, in raised voices and dramatic exits. But real strength, I had learned, is quieter. It's the strength to leave without demanding validation, the strength to choose peace over pride, the strength to accept that some relationships cannot be repaired without self-destruction. I didn't hate my daughter. I no longer needed her approval. That difference changed everything. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, not by erasing them, but by putting them into proper scale. By the time summer arrived in Stonebrook, the events that once dominated my thoughts had settled into the background of my life. They were still there, but no longer loud, no longer demanding. They existed the way scars do, visible if you look for them, but no longer painful to touch. Spring had passed quietly. With it went the last of the restless energy that had driven my decisions in the months before. I wasn't moving forward out of reaction anymore. I was simply living. That difference mattered more than I expected. My days took on a gentle rhythm. Mornings began early, not out of habit, but preference. I liked watching the world wake up slowly. The fog lifting from the trees, the first birds testing the air with hesitant songs. I made my coffee strong and drank on the porch, wrapped in a light jacket, even when the weather warmed. I found comfort in small consistencies. They reminded me that stability didn't need to come from other people. I didn't hear from Elena again for a long while. At first, I wondered if she was waiting, hoping time would soften me the way it had always softened me before. I wondered if she believed silence was temporary, that eventually I would reach out the way I always had. But the longer the quiet stretched, the more I realized something important. She wasn't waiting. She was adjusting. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. People adapt quickly when they must. Elena was no different. Without my presence as a safety net, she had been forced to build new routines, new supports, new expectations. I had removed myself not only from her life, but from her assumptions. And assumptions, I learned, are often the heaviest burden in any relationship. The first indirect update came through an old acquaintance I ran into at the hardware store. Someone who knew both of us well enough to connect the dots, but not well enough to feel entitled to details. "I heard your daughter move again," he said casually, scanning shelves for nails. "Yes," I replied just as casually. "She seems stressed." I nodded. Life can be that way. He waited, as if expecting more. When nothing came, he cleared his throat and changed the subject. That was becoming a pattern. People came to me with fragments of information, half expecting reaction. They didn't get it. And eventually, they stopped bringing fragments at all. I wasn't cold. I was finished. That summer, I took a short trip by myself. Nothing extravagant. Just a few days near the coast, where the air tasted of salt and the sound of the ocean erased any lingering thoughts. I walked barefoot along the shore, letting the waves wash over my ankles, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness. Not happiness in the excited sense. Not relief in the aftermath sense. Just lightness. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired, spoke when I wanted to, stayed silent when I didn't. No one mistook my quiet for availability. When I returned to Stonebrook, I noticed how easily I settled back into my life. There was no drop after the trip, no sense of escape, followed by disappointment. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't avoidance. This was alignment. The only time my chest tightened again was late one evening when I checked my mail and found a plain envelope addressed in Elena's handwriting. No return address. Just my name. I stood there for a long time, the envelope resting in my hand. I wasn't afraid of what it contained. I wasn't eager either. It simply represented a fork in the road, a moment where I could choose whether to reopen something I had already closed. Eventually, I took it inside. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the table and made dinner first, ate slowly, washed the dishes, sat by the window and watched dusk turn the trees into silhouettes. Only then did I return to the envelope. Inside was a letter. Not long, not short, carefully written, carefully controlled. She wrote about the children, about how they asked questions she didn't always know how to answer, about how things had been harder than she expected, about how she'd been forced to look at herself in ways she didn't like. She apologized, not directly, not fully, but enough to suggest she understood something had been lost. She asked if we could start again. I read the letter once. Then I read it again. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel softened. I felt something closer to sadness, but not the kind that demands action, the kind that acknowledges reality. Elena's letter wasn't wrong. It was late, it was cautious, and it was still centered around her discomfort more than my dignity. She wanted a reset without a reckoning. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. That was the hardest part, not emotionally, but ethically. I had spent my life believing that when someone reached out, it was my responsibility to meet them halfway. That belief had shaped every sacrifice I'd made. Letting the letter go unanswered felt like breaking a rule I'd lived by for decades. But rules are only useful if they serve truth. And the truth was simple. Starting again would require me to become smaller than I had fought so hard to stop being. I chose not to. The following weeks were quiet again. The letter never came up. No follow-up. No escalation. That told me Elena had said what she could say, not what needed to be said. Understanding that difference freed me from the last trace of obligation. As summer gave way to early autumn, I noticed something else shift. I stopped thinking of Elena as someone I was estranged from. I began thinking of her as someone I used to know. That mental shift changed the emotional weight entirely. Estrangement suggests unfinished business. Distance suggests possibility. But used to know carries no such tension. It simply acknowledges time. I began making plans again, not big ones, not future-oriented in the traditional sense, but plans that belonged to me. I volunteered a few hours a week at a local trade school, helping young men and women learn basic mechanical skills. They reminded me of myself at their age, eager, uncertain, hungry for direction but resistant to authority. They listened when I spoke, not because I demanded it, but because I didn't waste words. Respect, I found, flows naturally when you don't chase it. One evening, one of the students asked why I volunteered. I thought about it carefully before answering. Because I know what it's like to build something with your hands. I said, and have no one notice until it's gone. He nodded. He didn't ask more. That was enough. The seasons continued their quiet march forward. Leaves fell. Mornings grew crisp. The world carried on without commentary. And in that steady passage of time, something unexpected happened. I forgave Elena, not for her sake, for mine. Forgiveness didn't mean reopening contact. It didn't mean restoring access. It didn't mean rewriting history. It simply meant releasing the last thread that tied my peace to her understanding. She might never fully grasp what she had done. That was no longer a problem I needed to solve. I could hold compassion without proximity, memory without longing, love without access. Those distinctions changed how I understood myself. I wasn't a man who had been abandoned. I was a man who had stepped away. That difference is everything. By the time winter returned to Stonebrick, I felt something settle permanently into place. Not happiness, not closure, confidence, quiet, unshakable confidence. The kind that doesn't need witnesses, the kind that doesn't argue, the kind that doesn't return letters that arrive too late. And in that confidence, I finally understood the full weight of the decision I had made months earlier. I hadn't just left the table. I had reclaimed my voice by choosing when not to use it. Years don't pass the way people expect them to. They don't arrive with announcements or milestones neatly tied in bows. They slip by quietly, disguised as ordinary days, until one morning you realize the weight you once carried has been gone for a very long time. That was how it happened for me. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely. By the time the third winter settled over Stonebrick, my life no longer felt like a recovery. It felt like ownership. I wasn't rebuilding anything I'd lost. I was simply living in something I had finally claimed. The house no longer felt new, but it felt right. Every mark on the walls, every repair hinge, every creak in the floorboards belonged to me. There was no sense of intrusion here. No memory that made my chest tighten when I passed through a room. Even the silence had changed. It wasn't absence anymore. It was presence. Steady, unchallenged. I had stopped measuring time by family events. No birthdays circled on calendars with obligation attached. No holidays waited with expectation. Instead, time moved according to seasons and routines, according to weather and work and rest. In spring, I planted a small garden behind the house. Nothing elaborate. Vegetables I liked. Herbs I actually used. I worked the soil slowly, carefully, enjoying the ache in my hands. It reminded me that effort, when chosen freely, feels different. It nourishes instead of draining. In summer, I took longer walks. Sometimes I drove out to places I'd never had time for before. Lakes, old towns, quiet roads that didn't lead anywhere in particular. I learned something about myself on those drives. I didn't need a destination. I just needed forward motion without pressure. Occasionally, people asked about my family, new neighbors, acquaintances, the kind of casual curiosity that comes without history attached. Do you have children? They'd ask. Yes, I'd answer. Do they live nearby? No. And that was it. No explanation. No sadness. No discomfort. Just truth, stated plainly. I noticed how easy that answer had become, how neutral it felt. Once, that question would stir 1,000 emotions. Regret, hope, pain, defense. Now it stirred nothing. That told me everything I needed to know about how far I'd come. Elena still crossed my mind from time to time, but not in the way people imagine, not as a wound. More like an old chapter whose ending I remembered clearly, but whose details no longer demanded attention. I sometimes wondered how she told the story now, whether she framed it as betrayal, as stubbornness, as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. People rewrite history when they don't like the lessons it contains. But I also wondered if, late at night, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep, she ever replayed that dinner table moment the way I once did. Whether the words came back to her in an unguarded moment, "Shut up, Dad. Nobody cares." And whether, with time, she finally heard them the way I had, not as frustration, but as a line crossed. There were moments, rare ones, when I felt something like grief, not for the relationship itself, but for the version of myself that had believed endurance would eventually be rewarded. That version of me had lived a long time inside my bones. Letting him go was not easy, but it was necessary. I saw proof of that truth one afternoon at the trade school where I volunteered. A young man, barely 20, was arguing with his father in the parking lot. Voices raised, accusations flung carelessly. The father stood rigid, absorbing words meant to hurt. Something about the scene caught me off guard, not because it was unfamiliar, because it was. I watched for a moment, then turned away. Years earlier, I would have felt that scene in my chest, felt the urge to intervene, to advise, to fix. Now I felt only clarity. I had stepped out of that pattern. And stepping out meant I could see it for what it was. Cycles don't break themselves. Someone has to step away first. That realization deepened my sense of peace rather than disrupting it. I didn't need vindication. I didn't need acknowledgement. I didn't even need understanding from Elena or anyone else. Understanding had already arrived. Inside me, the world continued, as it always does. New cycles turned. Faces changed. Crises came and went. Through it all, my life remained remarkably stable. That stability wasn't built on predictability, but on boundaries that didn't bend under pressure. I had learned the difference. One autumn evening, while sorting through old boxes in the storage shed, I came across something I hadn't seen in years. An old notebook. Inside were lists I'd made long ago, goals, plans, responsibilities, names, dates, numbers. Elena's name appeared often. College expenses, wedding costs, home repairs, emergency funds. I sat on the floor for a long time, flipping through those pages. There was no anger in me as I read, just a quiet sadness for how thoroughly I had measured love by sacrifice, how completely I had believed my worth was tied to what I provided. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the box. Then I carried the box outside and burned its contents in the small fire pit behind the house. Not ceremonially, not dramatically, just thoroughly. I watched the pages curl and darken, releasing smoke into the evening air. When the fire died down, there was nothing left but ash. I didn't feel loss. I felt relief. That act marked something final inside me. Not because I erased the past, but because I stopped letting it define my present. After that, I slept deeply, dreamless. The next contact from Elena came much later than I expected. Years later, I was in town buying supplies when I saw her across the street. She was walking with the children, older now, taller, less shielded from the world. She froze when she saw me. So, did I. For a moment, neither of us moved. Time seemed to compress into that space between us, heavy with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't. She looked thinner, tired in a way that came from responsibility rather than exhaustion. Her posture was different, less certain, more careful. Our eyes met. I nodded. She hesitated, then nodded back. That was all. I turned and continued down the street. I didn't look back. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't catch. My steps didn't falter. The moment passed as easily as it arrived. That was when I knew, without question, that the story was finished. Not paused, not unresolved. Finished. There was no urge to revisit it. No curiosity about what she might say if she spoke. No desire to test whether time had changed anything. Because the truth was simple. Time had changed me. And that change didn't require validation from the person who once dismissed me. Later that evening, I sat on the porch as the sky faded into deep blue. Crickets filled the air. The world carried on, indifferent and beautiful. I thought about everything I had gained by walking away. Not money, not assets, not even peace. Exactly. What I gained was alignment, the ability to live without contradiction, to speak when I chose, to remain silent when it served me, to know that dignity does not depend on proximity. That knowledge settled into me like something permanent. I understood then that some endings don't announce themselves because they don't need to. They arrive quietly, take their place, and stay. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for forgiveness. Not for understanding. Not for reconciliation. I was simply living. And that, I realized, was the most powerful outcome of all. The final clarity didn't arrive with a revelation or a confrontation. It arrived on an ordinary morning, the kind I'd grown used to, quiet, steady, undemanding. I woke before sunrise, brewed my coffee, and stepped onto the porch as the first light brushed the tops of the trees. The air was cool, the world was calm, and for the first time in my life, that calm didn't feel temporary. It felt permanent. I stood there longer than usual, listening to the birds stir, watching the shadows retreat inch by inch. There was no ache in my chest, no old reflex urging me to check my phone, or replay conversations that would never happen. That habit had dissolved over time, leaving behind something much stronger than relief. Certainty. Not certainty about what others thought of me. Not certainty about how the story would be told by people who weren't there. Certainty about myself, about the life I was living and the life I had chosen to leave behind. For a long time, I believed that endings had to be loud to be real. That closure came with words spoken face to face, apologies exchanged, truths finally acknowledged. I believed that if something ended quietly, it wasn't really finished. It was just waiting. I was wrong. Some endings don't need witnesses. They don't need agreement. They don't even need understanding. They only need resolve. I had that now. The years had reshaped my days in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because I planned it, but because once I stopped contorting myself to fit into someone else's comfort, my life began arranging itself naturally. The routines I kept weren't defensive anymore. They were simply mine. Mornings belonged to me. Afternoons unfolded without urgency. Evenings settled without tension. I filled my time with things that didn't ask me to shrink. Reading, walking, working with my hands. Listening more than speaking. Speaking only when I wanted to. The small joys became obvious once the noise was gone. A warm cup of coffee held in both hands. The sound of wind moving through pine needles. The satisfaction of fixing something broken with patience instead of frustration. People came and went in my life, as they always do. Neighbors, acquaintances, friends made later in life, unburdened by history. They knew me as I was now, not as a role I had outgrown. They didn't expect anything from me beyond honesty and presence. In return, I gave both freely. Sometimes, someone would ask about my family. The question no longer caught me off guard. Yes, I'd say, I have a daughter. And when the next question came, do you see her often? I answered without flinching. No. There was no bitterness in that word. No, wait. Just fact. I learned that truth, when accepted fully, doesn't bruise. It steadies. I didn't follow Elena's life from a distance. I didn't check for updates or ask mutual contacts for information. Whatever path she walked now belonged to her. Mine belonged to me. The separation wasn't hostile. It was complete. Completion is different from forgiveness, though forgiveness had come too, quietly, without ceremony. I forgave her without reopening anything, without inviting her back into a place she no longer fit. Forgiveness wasn't a bridge. It was a release. I released the expectation that she would ever see me the way I had once needed to be seen. That release changed everything. One evening, while organizing old papers, I found the last object that still connected me to the man I used to be. A small note I'd written years earlier, tucked inside a book. It was a reminder to myself, a promise, really, that I would always be there for my family, no matter the cost. I held that note for a long time. I understood what the man who wrote it had meant. I respected his intentions. He wasn't weak. He was loyal. He was devoted. He believed love was proven through endurance. But endurance without dignity is not love. I tore the note in half and placed it in the fire. As the paper curled and darkened, I felt nothing but peace. Not because I had rejected my past, but because I had outgrown it. Later that night, sitting by the fire, I thought about how easily a lifetime of sacrifice can be erased with a single sentence when respect is missing. How quickly someone can mistake patience for permission. How silence, when imposed, becomes humiliation, but when chosen, becomes power. That distinction is what changed my life. I didn't reclaim my voice by shouting. I didn't reclaim my worth by arguing. I reclaimed both by leaving. Leaving didn't mean running away. It meant stepping forward into a life that no longer required me to beg for space at someone else's table. I used to believe that family was a final shelter, that no matter how hard the world was, you could always return to your own. I understand now that family, like any structure, must be maintained with mutual respect. When that respect collapses, staying inside only teaches others how much you'll tolerate. Walking away taught a different lesson. It taught that dignity has a price, and I was finally willing to pay it. The most surprising part of all this wasn't the quiet. It was how quickly the quiet became normal. How natural it felt to live without bracing myself for dismissal. How easy it became to breathe without tension. I didn't miss the chaos. I didn't miss the role I had played for so long. And I didn't miss being needed only when it was convenient. What I gained was something far more valuable than reconciliation. I gained ownership of my life. Ownership means you don't negotiate your worth. Ownership means you don't explain your boundaries. Ownership means you understand that peace isn't given, it's claimed. There are people who will hear this story and think it's harsh. They'll say a parent should endure anything. That blood outweighs behavior. That silence is abandonment. They're wrong. Endurance is not infinite. Blood does not excuse cruelty. And silence, when chosen to protect yourself, is survival. I didn't disappear out of anger. I disappeared out of clarity. And in that clarity, I found something I didn't know I was missing. Myself. I still live in Stonebrick. The seasons still change. The trees still stand. My days are unremarkable in the best possible way. No one raises their voice at me here. No one tells me be quiet. No one decides whether my words matter. They matter because I say them. And when I choose not to speak, that choice is mine too. That's how the story ends. Not with reconciliation, not with applause, not with regret. It ends with a man who finally understood that the sharpest response isn't always confrontation. Sometimes it's silence backed by action. And if you're still here listening to this story, maybe part of it felt familiar. Maybe you've swallowed words at tables where you once belonged. Maybe you've mistaken patience for love and endurance for loyalty. If that's you, remember this. You don't need permission to choose dignity. You don't need agreement to walk away. And you don't need noise to make your point. Before you go, do me one last favor. If my story resonated with you, support, subscribe, share where you're listening from, and pass it along. Quiet stories travel far when they reach the right people.